Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of the Van Build series. In this episode, we're going through the final stages of prep work to get the first full coat of primer on. We finished sanding off all the top coat of the white paint, cleaning up some of the Bondo bodywork spots, and we tape off all the windows so they won't get any paint on them. And the van finally gets a black coat of primer. We started off by cleaning up the hood. There were a lot of areas on the hood where rocks had chipped the paint, different things had happened to it, and it looked like it had been repainted at some point because there were chips that you could see through the paint, but they were still covered up with white paint. So that entailed a lot of sanding. Basically, we had to cut down through a couple layers of paint to get down to bare metal everywhere that there was a chip. And the reason we wanted to do that is so that you wouldn't see the lines in the top coat of the final paint job where the chip had occurred. So we had to smooth out those areas, basically taking them down to bare metal and feathering out the areas where it had cut through the different layers of paint. And so that took a couple different layers of sanding with a couple different grits of sandpaper in order to smooth it all out where you could not see the lines in the paint anymore. And even then, it would still take a couple coats of primer to cover that up properly. So to get ready for the primer, we started taping off all the windows. We went on the inside of the van for the windows that we had removed and taped off so we would hopefully get some paint in the window openings that we needed to cover as well. So we used some plastic sheets that were attached to masking tape on one end, cover up the openings. And it turns out the 5200 laid down flat in all the seams and was ready for paint. So then began the long task of sanding everywhere we had applied Bondo. And in order to get a good finish, we sanded all the way down to where you could see bare metal on each side of the flat sanding. So with the inline sander, it creates a plane where you basically sand down through until you get to metal, and once you reach the metal, you know where the low spots still are, because you can't go any farther than bare metal basically. So you know that those spots are more than likely going to take another round of Bondo. So we hit every spot on the driver or passenger side of the van, and we also did a technique called fogging on the back square panels, and that's the lines you see. Basically, I just took a can of spray paint and tried to get a real thin coat on those panels. And the reason you do that is so that you can sand over it real quick with the inline sander, and it shows you where the high and low spots are. There was also some areas at the top of the van where the primer was a little thick from our first coat, and we had to sand some of the runs out. So we did that and got it ready because we were planning to paint all the way to the top of the van when we put on the full coat of primer. One of the next steps that we had to do is sand down all the areas on the entire van where we hadn't already sanded. And that's because we wanted the metal to be clean and be scuffed so that the primer would bond to it effectively. Another thing that we had to do is we went ahead and removed the door handles so that we could get paint under all of those surfaces, and because we wanted to be able to sand right up next to them. And with the handles on there, it would have been almost impossible to sand close and not ruin the plastic of the door handles. So as you can see, most of the paint from the fogging came off of the square panels, which is good because that means they're relatively flat. On the passenger side of the van, we weren't as lucky. That's where there appeared to be a shelf mounted inside at one point, where people had loaded stuff onto the shelf and let it slide against the side of the van, punching a lot of dimples in the side. So in the previous episode, you saw us come by with a hammer and try to tap those dents in, but it turns out there still was a lot of work to be done on those panels. So we applied some Bondo, used the hammer some more, and hopefully once we apply the full coat of primer, we'll be able to sand them one time and see just a couple of areas where we need a little more Bondo or to be tapped in a little bit further. But the fogging practice should have gotten us pretty close to where we needed to be. And there were some areas on the top on this side where we had some runs, so we had to sand those as well. So we continued on scuffing up the white paint, using the air sander with 80 grit sandpaper on it, and going over the areas where we applied Bondo earlier in the day. Then we blew off the van so we could get a fresh look at where we needed to do some more sanding, and continued on with the air sander. We tried to get the front of the van as best we could because that's an area that you actually can see from the ground. So there was a couple runs from the first coat of primer that we had to get out of there and get it ready for paint. The next step was going over the entire van by hand, and that means getting in all the cracks and crevices with sandpaper and removing paint where you can't reach with power sanders. And it turns out there's a lot of creases in this van around all the window openings, the couple of lines on the bottom of the van. The doors have a couple of lines on them that you have to get into. Another thing that you have to do is open up the doors and sand around the door jambs. So as you spray, even with the doors closed, a little bit of paint goes through, and you want it to have a good surface to adhere to, because eventually we'll prime the door jambs and put a top coat on the door jambs. The reason that we'll do that is so when you open the doors, you don't see different colors. And that's one way you can quickly identify a cheaper paint job from a more detailed paint job. Basically, if you take the time to go to that effort, then when you open the doors, you can tell that the van is intended to be that color. We went around the van one more time with the air nozzle, blowing off all the dust to figure out where we needed any more sanding. It turns out that we needed to do some more sanding on the other side of the van. We had missed places like inside the wheel welds and under the sides of the van at the very bottom. These areas are less critical because we plan on using a spray-on truck bed liner to do the bottom sections, so that will cover up a lot of the mistakes basically in the body of the van. The next area that we focused on was removing the license plate cover off the front bumper because we planned on going ahead and priming the bumper black. Eventually we'd like to put an off-road style bumper on the van, but for right now we're going to prime the plastic bumper that's on it and spray it with truck bed liner when we get done with the paint. A couple other areas that needed a little more attention were the doors. And we also did around the hood where it mounts, basically the tracks inside where the rain gutters are to keep the water from going on the engine, and underneath the hood as best we could. Eventually we ended up taking the hood off and doing some work on it separately. So stay tuned for the next episode where we go through that process. In all the areas around the rear bumper and certain areas where there was bodywork, we ended up hitting those again with sandpaper and making sure that everything was going to be clean. We double checked the back doors and got those open and ready for paint. And once again went over the areas that we thought could potentially still be a problem with some hand sanding and got those areas cleaned up and ready for the top coat. The back area there had a run in it, so we used a block sander to get the run out so that when we put the first coat of primer on, it would end up being smooth and we wouldn't have to sand that out again. We had to take the seam off the back door where we had primed before because it was a hard edge, and when you have a hard edge like that, you'll definitely see it when you shoot the next coat of primer on the van. So we walked around the van, gave it a once over, made sure there weren't any spots that we had missed. We found a couple, sanded those a little bit. We also sanded off the spot filler that we had applied since it had dried, and blew everything off and got ready to tape up the windows. So we started off with the roll of plastic with the tape affixed to the top of it, and then taped up the other three sides. We found that the thicker tape tended to be harder to work with around the edges of the windows. So then we moved to the method of using the thinner 1-inch thick tape to basically place a perimeter around the window first and cover up the rubber that sealed the windows. From there we added the plastic and used the thicker 1.5-inch masking tape to tape the plastic down. And then we did the same theory with the front windshield of the van and pulled the plastic all the way over it and taped it down. We then moved and did the driver's side window in the same fashion. And then we covered up the engine bay with a sheet and covered up all 4 tires with the sheets, just to make sure that no overspray would get on the wheels, because we were planning to paint the wheel welds as well. From there, we suited up in the Tyvek suit, put on some glasses and a respirator, put the dogs inside so they wouldn't get in the paint, and began the process of spraying paint. So this was my first time ever spraying anything of this size. As you can see in the beginning, my strokes were not quite even, and there tended to be some spacing between that I didn't get good coverage on. I quickly learned that I needed to not really look so much at the lines that I was painting against, but just move in a uniform motion, effectively adding a certain amount of distance every time to achieve a half overlap as I was spraying. On the second coat, I tended to be much smoother, and another lesson that I learned was that I shouldn't move while painting the sides of the van. I needed to stay in one side, basically stay in one stance and paint as far as I could reach in that one stance. This really helped me to not have uneven passes and have the gaps in between, or either have too much overlap and cause runs. I worked around, did the hood, and then moved to the other side of the van. On the other side of the van, the paint went on a lot smoother, and I was definitely getting the hang of the painting process as I went through the other side. We ended up putting approximately 2 coats on the van to get really good coverage, so we would have plenty of depth to sand down through to smooth out any of the spots. We primed the back doors and then went around and used up all the excess paint in the wheel welds of the van. We wanted a good thick coat of primer there because the wheel welds of the van had been sprayed white and the undercoating of the van was also white, so we didn't want you to be able to look at the side of the van and see too much white remaining when we got done. From there, we went around and put another coat on the hood in the other direction. So basically, when I sprayed the hood the first time, I went top to bottom, and on the second pass, I went from side to side. When you vary the strokes like this, it tends to lay down a more even coat and avoids patterns in the paint. So that's all for episode 4 of the Van Build series. If you have any questions or comments, drop them below. If you liked what you saw, give it a thumbs up, and if you're ready for more, hit that subscribe button.